Today, I'm going to be tier ranking every single fantasy and sci-fi series I have started. The only exception is if the series only has one full-length novel published. Even with that qualification, there's still over 60 series on this list. That's all of them that I could think of that I read. I'm sure I'm missing some. But without wasting too much time so that this video isn't way too long, let's go over the categories. At the top, you got S tier. There can be only one. And as you've probably guessed, I'm only going to have one series up in that category. Second category, reread worthy. You can kind of think of these as my 5-star series. I read the series, I love them, and I'd be happy to read them again. The next category, this is more of a 4-star series. Glad I read it, which means I enjoyed the series, but I'm not sure if I'm going to go back and read it again. It was enjoyable that first time, but once was enough. Wish I read something else. This is the 3-star range for me, where I didn't hate the series, but with all of the good books out there that I haven't read yet, I wish I hadn't spent time on something that ultimately was just a 3-star series, and instead I would have preferred to give something else a chance, because who knows when you're going to find your next 5-star read. Next category, abandoned. These are series that I started and then it's just been so long since I've read them that I'm not necessarily interested in continuing them, or if I did continue them, I might have to start over again. And then the last category, DNF. And this is going to be, I DNF'd it not because I just lost interest, I DNF'd it because I wasn't enjoying it, and I actively don't want to continue. So the first series, we got Lord of the Rings. This is going to be reread worthy. I think I've reread it 3 times, so that's proof enough that that's where it belongs. Codex Alera. Right now, I'm only 1 book into the 6-book series, and that was a 3-star read. So right now, it's in the wish I read something else. But I do see potential in this series, so I could see myself moving it up. Now, if I don't enjoy the second book, it's going to move from wish I read something else to DNF. Third series, Dresden. That's reread worthy. It's another one that I've already reread, one of my favorite series of all time. Mistborn. This is another one I've reread, and that's Mistborn Era 1. Absolutely loved it. Definitely belongs in the reread worthy category. The Winter King. That's book 1 of the Warlord Chronicles. I will, for now, put that towards the back of the reread worthy. I may reread it. It's kind of on the edge here. It's more of a 4.5 star series for me. The Last Kingdom. That's the first book in the Saxon Tales. Again, I'm only 1 book in, so this could definitely change. But that's going to be in the glad I read it. Right now, I don't see that being a series I'm going to reread, but it's one I'm enjoying while I read it. Harry Potter. That was reread worthy. Now, this is a tough one in that I've reread it several times. I don't know if I'll reread it again, at least not for my own joy. I may reread it to my kids someday, but other than that, I don't know if it's one I'll ever pick up to read for myself again. Aragon. It's going to be glad I read it. Not one I'm going to come back to it, though. Name of the Wind. That's Kingkiller Chronicles. That's definitely a reread worthy. So even though the 3rd book may never come out, I loved reading both of these books and glad I read them and would happily reread them sometime again. Wheel of Time. This is a glad I read it. First part of the series probably would have been in a wish I read something else, but when I picked up Wheel of Time, I didn't have a TBR, so since I didn't hate the book, I kept giving the next book a try, and by the end of the series, I really loved the last 4 books, like most people that have read the series. Ender's Game. I have read Ender's Game, Ender's Shadow. There's the first Formaic War and the second Formaic War. trilogies, I decided to put these all in one category, and that's going to be the Glad I Read It. Because I did enjoy reading all of that series, and when the third book in the second Formatic War comes out, I will read that, but I don't see myself ever going back and rereading Ender's Game. Joe Abercrombie, First Law, that's a DNF. Read the first book, did not enjoy it. There was no plot. I was bored the whole time, and I wasn't invested in the characters. I didn't care about them. So, yeah, there is nothing in it to keep me going from that series. Night Angel is next. That's going to be in the Wish I Read Something Else. So I read it because I really liked the Black Prism and Lightbringer. Night Angel just didn't work for me. Next series is Lightbringer, which I was just mentioning. That's another one that's at the tail end of reread worthy. Actually, I'm going to move it up a little bit. I did enjoy reading it, and the first... Yeah, I'm not going to qualify that anymore. I enjoyed Lightbringer. I easily could see myself rereading it again now that I think about it. I loved all the twists and turns, and maybe some of the things that didn't make sense to me before would make more sense on a reread. And then you get to Stormlight Archive. There can be only one. This is easily my favorite series of all time. It's not even close at this point. And Leviathan Wakes, that's the first book of The Expanse. That's in the Abandoned category. Now, I actually gave Leviathan Wakes 4 stars, so I did enjoy it. But there was nothing really calling me to read the next book in the series. It was lacking something to catch my interest. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just that sci-fi, and I'm not as big of a sci-fi fan as I am a fantasy fan. For whatever reason, after finishing the first book, I never cared to pick up the second. And at this point, I don't see myself ever continuing the series. So that's Abandoned. I didn't DNF it because I hated it. I just had no interest in continuing. The Written. So this is another tough one where I'm only one book in. And right now, it's with Codex Alera and the Wish I Read Something Else. It hasn't been my favorite. I had to almost read the first book twice with all the rereading I was doing to make sure I was following what was going on. With that said, I've heard the second and third book of the series are really good and the best part of the series, so I'm going to be giving the second book a chance, and at that point, we'll have a better idea of, is it going to move up to the Glad I Read It or possibly move down to the DNF. Theft of Swords. So this is the first book of Raya Revelations. That is absolutely reread worthy. Mistborn Era 2. Although I have reread Mistborn Era 2 right before the Lost Metal came out, and I'll probably reread it again since it's part of the Cosmere and there's a lot of Cosmere connections in there, that's the Glad I Read It. It was 4 stars throughout the series for me. So entertaining, but if it was a standalone series that had nothing to do with the Cosmere, I probably wouldn't reread it again. Fallen, Alex Veras. So this is one of my favorite series that I've discovered in the last year. So that's absolutely reread worthy. It's going to go right next to Dresden. Raya is going to move forward some too. Yeah, we'll go with that for now. Live Ship Traders. I'll put this in Glad I Read It. And the Farseer Trilogy. I'll put both of those in the Glad I Read It. Really enjoyed both of them. These are kind of the exception to the Glad I Read It category, where they were overall 5-star series for me. I'm not sure if I'm ever going to do a reread just because the style isn't my style. I prefer more plot-focused, fast-paced books, and these are slow, character-driven books. With that said, I really enjoyed them, so it's done really well. It just takes a lot to get me to go back to that style, so I'm not sure if I would ever reread these. The Memoirs of Lady Trent. This is probably going to end up in the glad I read it category. I've only read the first book, A Natural History of Dragons, and it's also not... I didn't immediately want to pick up the second book. So there's a risk this moves into the abandoned category. But right now it hasn't gotten to that point. Faithful and the Fallen. That's a glad I read it. I wasn't as high up on Faithful and the Fallen as a lot of people on Booktube. There are some stylistic choices that I didn't like. Promise of Blood, that's the Power Mage trilogy. I've only read the first book, and that's more in the abandoned category. It was in the wish I read something else, and I decided, you know what? I don't see this series necessarily getting better as it goes like I do for Codex Alera and the Ridden. So I'm just going to cut my losses here and abandon it. Red Rising, that was another DNF. I did finish the first 3 books of the series and didn't like those nearly as much as what other people did. I was finally starting to come around to it. And then the ending of the 3rd book happened. And at that point, I was done with the series. So that's a DNF. I have no plans of ever continuing that. Raya Revelations, that's going to be in the glad I read it. Or not Raya Revelations, Raya Chronicles. So these are just fun standalone novels related to Raya Revelations. So it kind of tells the backstory of Royce and Hadrian. So I do enjoy those. Honestly, I may reread them at some point, but that's going to be more just because I'm looking for something quick, simple, easy to reread, and not because I need to reread this series. Especially since Raya Chronicles really are more of standalone novels. They don't read like a typical series would read. Superpowers. 2 books in, absolutely reread worthy. It's one of my favorite series this year, and I hear the next 2 books are even better than the first 2 books. So, no doubt about it, reread worthy. Great Coats, another series I loved. That's going to be reread worthy as well. Fred the Vampire Accountant. Yep, talked about this quite a bit. It will go in reread worthy. Spellslingers. This one surprised me. Through the first 2 books, it would have been in the glad I read it category. But books 3 and 4 I absolutely loved, and I'm currently reading book 5, and I could easily see this being a series I come back to again. Maybe not as high as Mistborn, though. Spellslingers, that's by Sebastian de Castell. That'll go in the glad I read it category. So 4 books in? No, 3 books in. And I do see the series picking up, but based on the trajectory I'm seeing one book from the next, I'd be surprised if it moved up to the reread worthy. Next series, you got Orconomics, book 1 of the Dark Prophet saga. That's in... it's towards the back of the glad I read it category. So Orconomics, I really enjoyed the second half of the book. First half took me a while to get into, and then the second book, it was the same thing. It took me half the book to get into it. The problem was the second book is twice as long as the first book. So I had to read basically a whole book's length before I got to the part of the book that I was actually enjoying. So glad I read it, but kind of wish I read something else too. So this is kind of on the border of these 2. Legends of the First Empire. That's in the glad I read it category. I may end up doing a reread just because I do like how it ties into Rhaenyra and Rise and Fall. So similar to Mistborn Era 2, where I'll reread it because of how it relates to other sub-series in a larger world. But if it was a completely standalone series and had nothing to do with Raya Revelations, I probably wouldn't reread it on its own. White Sand, that's a wish I read something else. No doubt about it. Not worth the time. Fortunately, since it was a graphic novel, it wasn't a lot of time. I probably couldn't have read a full novel in the time I read these 3 graphic novels. Lies of Loch Lamora. This is going to go in the abandoned category. I did read the first 3 books. So I read the first one. I thought it was alright. Read the second one. I liked the second half of it. And I think the main reason I liked it is there weren't the jump in timelines. And I thought I was going to like the third book because I was expecting the timeline jumps to be done with. They were not. They came back with a vengeance in the third book, and I didn't enjoy it at all. And at this point, no plans on continuing the series. So I didn't DNF it. Well, I kind of DNF'd it. This is on the verge. There's a slight chance I would continue with book 4 if or when it comes out. But I don't see that happening. Cradle. This was an abandoned series. And it's one I could see myself picking back up. So the progressive fantasy wasn't working for me at the time. And I think I started Cradle and Dresden at the same time. And both of them were leaning towards 3-star series for me, but they were good palate cleansers. But I decided I only need one of these series. I don't need to continue both of them to be used as palate cleansers. And I continued with Dresden, which then went on to be one of my favorite series of all time. So I could go back to Cradle. It just has to be something that I'm feeling more in the mood for before I give it a legitimate second chance. Kings of the Wild, that's the band. That's going to be a DNF. I did read the first 2 books, and obviously the third book's not out yet. And the humor did not work for me. And if you don't find these books funny, there's not a lot else to get from this book. So if you don't like the humor, you probably won't like the book, and that's what happened with me. So I DNF'd the series. The next series, that's going to be Murderbot. That's the Wish I Read Something Else. I kind of got caught up in the Booktube hype for Murderbot, and that was why I read it and kept reading it and kept wanting to like it because everyone on Booktube was liking it. But I really didn't. Again, maybe it's just because it's sci-fi. My preferences don't lie with sci-fi. But whatever reason it was, it didn't work for me, and I wish I spent that time reading something else. Forging Hephaestus. This is The Villain's Code by Drew Hayes. It's going to be another reread worthy. Everything I've been reading by Drew Hayes is absolutely reread worthy. The Ember Blade. Right now, that's going to be in the Glad I Read It category. Book 2 did just come out, and I haven't read that yet. But I could see this staying here, being reread worthy because I really like Book 2. Or if I don't like Book 2 with how long it is, it could easily drop down to the Wish I Read Something Else. The Rise and Fall, Michael J. Sullivan. Again, I could reread it just because of the relations to Raya Revelations and Legends of the First Empire. But generally speaking, I wouldn't read Nolan Fairlane and Ezra Hardin again. Now, Ezra Hardin hasn't come out yet, so that could definitely change my opinion on where I rank The Rise and Fall overall. Poppy War, that's easy DNF. I did enjoy the first book, despite how much I didn't like the protagonist, Rin. But then Book 2, Rin just got way too annoying for me. I could not stand it. I forced myself to read the book, which I hated the whole time doing it. And then I tried to read Book 3 because I heard how great Book 3 is. I literally got like one sentence in and said, nope, can't do this. Closed the book. Have never looked back at that series again. No way will I ever pick it up. Senlin Ascends. That's an abandoned series. I read the first 2 books. They were both alright. And I'm guessing if I kept on reading the series, they both would have been alright. But that would have landed them squarely in the Wish I Read Something Else. They were alright, but they weren't in any of these top 3 categories. which is where I want all of my books to be. All right, the next series, The Wolf. Book 2, The Spider. I think this is Under the Northern Sky. That's abandoned. I'm not going to be continuing that series if or when the third book ever comes out, or if it's already out and I don't know about it. They were fine books, but they were never going to land in one of these top 3 categories. If I completed the series, they would have been squarely in the wish I read something else category, which I try to minimize those. If I think something's going to end up in this category, especially after the second book, it tends to become an abandoned series. Cinder. This is a fairy tale retelling series that my wife actually suggested I read before I found Booktube, and I did enjoy it. That is certainly going to be in the glad I read it category. It's not one I actually expected to like all that much. Fairy tale retellings aren't really the type of fantasy that I want to read, but I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected to. Blood of the Heirs. This started off in the glad I read it with book 1, and then the more I read of this series, the more tired of the series I got until it fell squarely into the wish I read something else. Rage of Dragons. Absolutely reread worthy. One of my favorite series that I found because of Booktube. So, absolutely loved it. Jade City. So, this is the Green Bone saga. I'm struggling with this one. It's kind of in the middle of glad I read it and wish I read something else. Because each book did end up being 4 stars for me. But I didn't get nearly as much out of it as most people would. Again, character-focused novels tend to not be my favorite. So yeah, I'm sure I could have easily found other series that I liked more than the Greenbone Saga. Dune, absolutely abandoned. Now this, I read Dune mainly because I really like the cover and I want to own this book because of the cover. But I was never going to continue on with the series. I viewed this as a standalone when I was reading it, and it was a 3-star standalone. So I'm glad I read it, and that if I hadn't read it, it would be bugging me. But I'm never going to read it again, and I'm never going to continue with the series. Atlas 6, this is another abandoned one. I think I gave Atlas 6 4 stars. And when I finished it, I was looking forward to book 2. But the longer it's been since I've read Atlas 6, the less interested I've been in continuing the series. Shadow of the Gods. I think this is Bloodsworn. Right now, it's in the wish I read something else. Again, ever since finishing Faithful and the Fallen, John Gwyn's writing just hasn't quite worked out for me. I just can't get into his stories anymore. Word Gods. This is the Timelessness series. That's going to be abandoned. I read the first book, and it just didn't do enough for me to get me to want to read the second book. And then enough time's gone by where I'd probably have to reread Word Gods in order to remember enough in order to continue the series. And I'm not interested in rereading Word Gods, so it's an abandoned series. Fireborn. This is going to hurt some people. It's going to be in the wish I read something else category. So I did really like Fireborn, book 1. But then book 2 and book 3 were too much teenage angst, and that was driving too much of the plot. So it was not my style at all at that point. The Coward. This is the Quest for Heroes. Right now, it's in the glad I read it category. Still need to read The Warrior. The Coward. I like the idea better than I like the execution, but still like the story enough that I'm glad I read it. Threadlight. This was one that Voice of War started off where it would be in the Glad I Read It. Then book 2, Stones of Light, moved it up to the reread worthy category. And then Bonds of Chaos moved it back down. And the longer I've gone since I've read Threadlight, the less interested I have been in Threadlight. So I will put it in the Glad I Read It category, but it's slowly falling in my memory. It's making its way down to the Wish I Read Something Else. And Of Blood and Fire. Book 1 would have been squarely in the Wish I Read Something Else because it was too much like Aragon to me. But book 2 moves this series easily up into the reread worthy, and I cannot wait to get to book 3. Shadows of the Atom. Right now, it's in the Glad I Read It. Barely in the Glad I Read It. There's been one really good book, 2 books that I haven't liked, and then 4 books that have been decent to good books. And now there's 3 books left. So this series has kind of been all over the place for me. I have heard the last 3 books are likely going to be my favorites in the series. So hopefully that can kind of solidify its spot in at least the Glad I Read It, if not reread worthy. His Majesty's Dragons, that goes right next to the Memoirs of Lady Trent, where I've read 1 book. Right now I'm glad I read that 1 book. Not sure if I'll continue the series. Not because I didn't like the first book. Just nothing's really calling me or pulling me to read that second book. So it's at risk of falling into the abandoned category. But for now, it's still in the Glad I Read It. Ashes of Averin. This is kind of a complicated one. I think I read the first book at the wrong time. So I just was not in the right mindset to read that book, which would put it in the Wish I Read Something Else category. I should have read something easier at that time. I would have been more likely to enjoy an easier read, and it would have saved a touch of light for a time when I was in the right headspace to fully appreciate the book. The Swordsman's Lament. Right now it's Glad I Read It. Will not reread this one so far, but I haven't read The Swordsman's Descent yet, or The Swordsman's Intent. So could easily move from where it's at. Wistful Ascending, book 1 of the Hybrid Helix. That is absolutely going to be a reread worthy series so far. Again, I'm only 1 book in, but what I read of book 1 was absolutely fantastic, and I'm looking forward to getting to book 2 and book 3. So I believe that is every single fantasy and sci-fi series I've read. Let me know what you think of my ratings. And until next time, bye.